In this video, we'll take a look at how to create our own custom serverless component that will deploy a DynamoDB table on AWS. And we will publish this to NPM so we can see how other people can use the custom component we created. So to get started, let's just look at how to create a simple hello world component. So I have a package.json with these two dependencies, and I have a serverless.yaml file. And in this, I have a name and my custom component. And of course, this can be named whatever we want. And to determine what component we're using, we have this field here, and we got two options. You can either reference an npm module, or you could reference a folder in your own project. So that's what we're going to use. So let's go ahead and create that. And inside your folder, you're going to want a serverless.js file. So that's what this component is going to reference, is this JS file here. So I'm going to bring in component from serverless core, going to extend that component and export it here. And each component has at least two methods. It has a default method and a remove method. So what that means is if I run SLS in this project, it's going to look at my YAML file, look at all the components. In this case, we got one. And for each of the components, it's going to look at the serverless.js file and run the default method. So in this case, we're just logging a debug statement. So I'm just going to write debug here just to see it. So there you go. That's all you got to do to get a component going. Of course, we want to do more than log statements. We want to probably deploy something to AWS. So why don't we bring in the AWS SDK? And let's quickly make a function that creates a Dynamo table. In front of me, I got a create method here. So it's going to set up the AWS SDK with US East 2, the credentials. So when you initially set up the serverless framework, you had to put your AWS credentials in a certain location so it would all work. This is basically referencing that location. Alternatively, you can put your credentials in this project and it would reference that if it exists. But in my case, it's referencing that original location. Then we're going to call create table. And at this point, this has nothing to do with the serverless framework. This is just interacting with the AWS SDK. So if you're wondering where I got these fields, you could just look it up on AWS's documentation on the API. It's actually pretty straightforward to look at. So it's pretty nice. So you could just reference that, and basically anything on the AWS SDK are things you could do with this serverless component. In our case, we're making a DynamoDB table. And then I'm just returning the ARN and the name. If we look at our default method now, so I'm calling the create method, I'm passing in this, which ends up being the component. And I'm passing a hard-coded name here, which is what this value is going to end up being. And then I'm doing some state stuff. So we'll look at that in a second. But first, let's just deploy this and see how this works. Okay, that was fast, way faster than what we're used to with the serverless framework. Is because we're not using CloudFormation in this case. We're just using APIs. And let's check it out. Awesome. So it created the table. Really good. And I also mentioned this spot here. So the reason why we're going to set the state of this component to .name to my table is because it's helpful to keep track of certain things. So you might be wondering, well, what does this even mean? If you go in the .serverless folder here and you look at template my custom component, this is referencing this thing. And if we look at that, name equals my table. So basically, when I set something on the state of this component and I save it, it's creating this file here. So the reason why that's helpful is because when we want to remove this thing, we want to remember what that name is. So here I added a remove method, and it's setting up the SDK like before, but instead of creating a table, we're deleting this table, and we're giving it a table name of component.state.name. So we're getting that component by passing this into the remove method, and it's referencing the component.state.name, it's getting that state from this file here. So now we can go ahead and remove this. And of course, it's really important when you're making a component to have a rollback feature of some kind. So that's why we always have a remove method. When we deploy stuff, we want to also tear it down as well. So let's go ahead and try that out. So I'm going to do SLS remove. And it's done. Let's check it out, see if it removed it, and it did. Wonderful. So nice, we have a DynamoDB component. Before we publish this to NPM, we want to make sure that it's flexible for other people to use. And one thing that stands out to me is the hard-coded name we have here. So I would imagine that if other people are using our component, they would want to define the name. We could also point out that all of this is hard-coded as well, and maybe we want to make this flexible or configurable. But let's just pretend we're happy with all this, and we just want to make the name configurable. So how do we do that? Well, if we go to the serverless.yaml file, we'll add a inputs field here, and we'll give a name of zebra. And now in my default method, the first parameter that comes in are my inputs that are defined right here. And instead of hard-coding the name, I'm just going to put inputs.name right here. So let's see if that works. Okay, great. It's creating the zebra table, and I've saved this name from the inputs on my state, which we can see right here. So removing this is going to be no problem because it's going to remember that. So if I do SLS remove, and now it's removing it. Perfect. Okay, so let's publish this to NPM. Actually, I've already done that, and I'll show you what I've published. I initialized a new package.json, called it Gary S. Jennings SLSDB, changed the main file to reference serverless.js, added the dependencies, basically copied and pasted that serverless.js file component that we made, that custom component, and just put it right in here. And then I published it. So now it's available on NPM, which is great. So what does it look like to now use this in a future project? So what I've done is initialized a package.json. I've made a serverless.yaml file, and we want to bring in a DynamoDB component here. And rather than figure out how to do that ourselves or write our own custom component, we can just reference what's already available on NPM. In our case, we know that we had just deployed our own here. So I'm going to look for it. Gary S. Jennings SLSDB. Okay, that's a thing. Great. So I'm going to reference that. And let's just pretend that it had really good documentation here, and it told us that we need inputs. So I'm going to give it a name of giraffe. And let's check it out. Okay, and let's confirm. Perfect. So it's working. Awesome. So that is a quick demo of how to create your own components, publish them, and use them in your future project.